What if I told you the deadliest tornado in history wasn't in Oklahoma, Kansas, or anywhere in America's Tornado Alley? What if I told you it happened in 1989, claimed over 1,000 lives in a single evening, and you've probably never even heard of it? April 26, 1989, a date that should be burned into every history book. But chances are, this is the first time you're learning about it. This is the story of the Daulatpur-Saturia tornado, the forgotten disaster that revealed a harsh truth about whose tragedies the world chooses to remember. Let me take you to central Bangladesh, April 26, 1989. The Manitganj district sits in the heart of the country, a patchwork of rural villages where families lived in modest homes and worked the land that had sustained them for generations. But something had been wrong for months. The region had been gripped by a brutal drought that stretched back half a year. Crops were dying in the fields. The earth had turned to dust. People were desperate. The situation had gotten so dire that President Mohammad Ershad had called for the entire nation to pray for rain. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon should have been a blessing. After 6 months of watching the sky for any sign of relief, those clouds meant hope. But on this evening, they meant something very different. Here's something most people don't know. Bangladesh is actually the third most tornado-prone country in the entire world, right after the United States and Canada. The country averages 6 tornadoes every single year, and they almost always strike during a very short, dangerous window from mid-March to mid-May. But here's the critical difference that made April 26th so catastrophic. In the United States, we have sophisticated radar systems, sirens that can be heard for miles, and reinforced buildings. In Bangladesh in 1989, they had none of that. No warning systems, no storm shelters, and the homes themselves were built from mud, bamboo, and light materials that couldn't withstand even moderate winds. When a tornado touches down in the American Midwest, people lose property, but they have a fighting chance. In Bangladesh, they are defenseless. The population density made everything worse. These weren't spread out farms like you see in Kansas. These were tightly packed villages where hundreds of families lived within a few square kilometers. So when evening came on April 26th and the sky began to darken, people in Daulatpur and Saturia looked up with hope. The clouds meant rain. Rain meant relief. Saida Begum, a 30-year-old woman living in Saturia, would later remember that moment. She said, "I saw black clouds gathering in the sky. Just another storm," she thought. Just the rain they'd been praying for. If you're fascinated by the raw power of nature and the stories behind history's most devastating storms, make sure to subscribe to Stormforge. We're bringing you the forgotten disasters, the untold stories, and the science behind the storms that changed the world. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. On April 26, the atmosphere over Bangladesh was a loaded gun. A low-pressure system was sitting nearby, acting like a giant invisible whirlpool in the air. From the Bay of Bengal, warm, moist air was flooding northeast, the fuel. From the Himalayas, cool, dry air was rushing south, the spark. And high above everything, the jet stream was screaming across the region at 150 miles per hour. This wind shear, winds at different altitudes blowing at different speeds, is what turns a normal thunderstorm into a rotating supercell. By noon, everything was ready. It wasn't a question of if a tornado would form. It was only a question of when. The answer came at 12:30 UTC, 6:30 in the evening local time. The tornado touched down just outside Daulatpur. From the very first moment, this was massive. Witnesses estimated it was nearly a mile wide, about 1.5 kilometers across. It immediately began tracking east towards Saturia, carving a path that would eventually stretch 50 miles long. Wind speeds inside the vortex were estimated at between 210 and 252 miles per hour. For context, that's stronger than most Category 5 hurricanes. The tornado was officially rated F3 on the Fujita scale, but that rating is misleading. The scale is based on damage to structures. Since the homes in Bangladesh were so fragile, they disintegrated instantly, making it impossible for scientists to tell if they'd been hit by F3 winds or F5 winds. Let me explain what winds that powerful can do. At 250 miles per hour, wind can drive a piece of straw through a telephone pole like a nail. It can turn a piece of sheet metal into a deadly projectile. It can pick up a car and throw it hundreds of feet, and it can tear a house from its foundation and reduce it to splinters in seconds. Sayeeda Begum, the woman who had seen the black clouds gathering, suddenly understood that this was not the rain they'd prayed for. She said, "In moments, we found we were flying along with the house." The tornado literally lifted her and her home into the air. The sound was described by survivors as like 1,000 freight trains running at full speed. The sky turned an unnatural greenish-black color. Windows exploded inward. Walls simply disintegrated. The ground itself shook, and then came the destruction. The official casualty count stands at approximately 1,300 lives lost in a matter of minutes. In 2022, some researchers challenged this figure, suggesting the number might be lower, perhaps closer to 256. But whether the true number is 256 or 1,300, a Bangladesh tornado still holds the record as the deadliest in human history. 12,000 people were injured. Broken bones, lacerations from flying debris, crushing injuries from collapsed buildings. 80,000 people were left completely homeless in a single evening. Over 20 villages were destroyed, not damaged, erased. Survivors described scenes from an apocalypse. They saw people lifted into the air by the winds. They saw livestock displaced hundreds of meters away. They saw massive trees ripped from the earth, roots and all. Brick homes that had stood for generations were reduced to piles of rubble. Families were separated in an instant. The tornado didn't discriminate. It claimed the old and the young, the strong and the weak. Saturia was hit the hardest. The tornado carved directly through the heart of the town. Every single home within a 6-square-kilometer area was completely destroyed. The Bangladesh Observer newspaper reported the devastation was so complete that, barring some skeletons of trees, there were no signs of standing infrastructures. Imagine looking out over what used to be your neighborhood and seeing nothing. Not rubble, not ruins, just flat ground with a few bare tree trunks. That's not a neighborhood that was hit by a tornado. That's a neighborhood that was erased from existence. While Daulatpur and Saturia were being destroyed, 40 kilometers to the east, a second tornado touched down in the Narsingdi district. This second tornado claimed 5 more lives and injured 500 others, but it barely gets mentioned in historical records. Even in tragedy, some victims are more forgotten than others. When the tornado finally dissipated, survivors emerged into a landscape they didn't recognize. Victims were found across the area, sometimes miles away from where they had been. There was no electricity, no phone lines, no way to call for help, no ambulances, no hospitals nearby that were still standing. People were trapped under debris, injured and bleeding, calling out for help that couldn't come. And then came the compounding tragedy. Remember the drought? Now the tornado had brought intense hail and rain that destroyed what little remained of the crops. The storm that people had prayed would bring relief had instead brought complete devastation. In the days that followed, food became scarce, disease began to spread. With sanitation systems destroyed, central Bangladesh descended into a humanitarian crisis of hunger and sickness. The government of Bangladesh was overwhelmed. They requested international aid. Medical teams and food relief eventually arrived, but slowly. 80,000 people needed new homes. The scale was simply too massive. The estimated damages were around $1.5 million. That sounds low compared to US tornadoes that cost billions. But the reason isn't because the tornado was weaker. It's because the people who lived there had almost nothing to lose materially. Their homes were modest, their possessions were few, but they lost everything that mattered. They lost their families, they lost their friends, they lost their sense of safety. And then, to add insult to injury, the world forgot about them. Media coverage at the time was minimal. Bangladesh was far from major Western media centers. The victims weren't wealthy or famous. 1989 had other major global events happening. In the hierarchy of disasters, some tragedies are simply louder than others. When a tornado strikes Oklahoma and claims 20 lives, It's national news for a week. When a tornado potentially claims 1,300 lives in Bangladesh, it's a footnote. This wasn't the first time Bangladesh had been struck by a catastrophic tornado. In 1972, at least 200 lives were lost in northern Bangladesh. In 1973, 681 people perished in Maniganj. In 1977, 500 people did not survive when Solanama village was flattened. In 1996, 700 lives were claimed in the Tangal district. Notice the pattern? All of these tornadoes struck in April or early May. All were catastrophic, and all have been largely forgotten by the world outside Bangladesh. The risk hasn't gone away. Population density continues to grow. Building standards have improved slightly, but not nearly enough. Warning systems are better, but still inadequate. It's not a question of if another devastating tornado will strike Bangladesh. It's a question of when. Here's what this story teaches us. Nature doesn't care about borders, wealth, or who's watching. A tornado in Bangladesh is just as powerful as one in Oklahoma. But the outcome depends entirely on what we as humans have built. The lack of preparation, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of global attention. All of that cost over 1,000 lives on April 26, 1989. Think about the imbalance. When the Joplin tornado claimed 161 lives in 2011, documentaries were made. Millions of dollars poured in. The world watched. When the Daulatpur tornado claimed nearly 10 times that many lives, the world moved on. Both are tragedies. Both deserve remembrance. But some lives, it seems, echo louder in history than others. Saida Begum and the other survivors live with trauma to this day. They watched their worlds disappear in minutes. They lost family members, friends, neighbors, and then the world ignored them. Imagine surviving the worst tornado in human history and having no one remember it happened. Imagine trying to rebuild your life after losing everything, and the rest of the world doesn't even know your tragedy occurred. This isn't just a story about a tornado. It's a story about vulnerability and injustice. It's a story about the fact that we remember the disasters that happened to wealthy countries and forget the disasters that happened to poor ones. The Daulatpur-Saturia tornado should be taught in every school that teaches about natural disasters, not just because of the death toll, but because forgetting it says something about us. It reveals whose lives we consider worthy of remembering. April 26, 1989 wasn't just another date in Bangladesh. It was the day the sky opened and swallowed entire villages. It was the day over 1,000 people vanished in minutes. It was the day 80,000 were left with nothing. And it was the day the world looked away. Nature does not discriminate, but humanity does. When we forget the Daulatpur-Saturia tornado, we're not just forgetting a storm. We're forgetting the people who lived through it, who perished in it, who survived it. And we're deciding, consciously or not, whose lives matter enough to remember. This is the deadliest tornado you've never heard of, until now. Remember Daulatpur, remember Saturia, remember April 26, 1989, and remember that every life lost in a natural disaster matters, regardless of where they lived or how wealthy they were.